Why do you want to marry more than one wife? And it doesn't have to do with needing love. It doesn't have anything to do with love. It doesn't have anything to do with romance. On one hand, it had to do with having the opportunity to have more and more and more sons, primarily, daughters as well, to help take care of the grounds, help take care of the farm. In Solomon's case, there were political alliances. He married Pharaoh's daughter so that Egypt, who was Israel's perennial enemy, would not fight Israel. You're not going to engage in battle with your son-in-law or your brother-in-law. And so these 700 wives and these 300 mistresses, a big part of them were political alliances. Solomon wants to have peace in the world. And to have peace in the world, he marries all these women. So where was his love? He loved peace. He loved that prestige that he got. He would not be making money if he was engaging in war. You have to spend money when you're in war, as we well know from the last decade. Solomon didn't want that. And so Solomon had this misplaced love, and he violated the law of God, as the historian tells us here. Solomon did what God had told him not to do. Don't marry all these different women from these various groups that worship these various gods. Don't marry them. And in fact, in Deuteronomy chapter 17, in a law specifically geared towards kings, in anticipation of the day when Israel would have a king, God said, your king should not marry multiple wives. And I believe the idea is there, don't engage in political alliances for marriage. Because of course God knew where to lead. And so Solomon took that first step. He gave in to his lust. He gave in to his desire. His heart belonged to somebody else besides God. And it wasn't the women. They just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Solomon's love was for something else. International prestige, money, peace, or whatever it was. But then we see in verses 4 through 8 that this sin, this temptation, these desires rather, gave birth to sin. Look what happens, beginning in verse 4. And again, pay attention to the words that are emphasized over and over again. For when Solomon was old, now Solomon didn't leave God when he was a teenager. Solomon didn't leave God when he was in college. Solomon left God when he was on Social Security. It was when he was old that he left God. His wife turned his heart away after other gods, and his heart was not wholly devoted to the Lord his God as the heart of David his father had been. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the detestable idol of the Ammonites. And Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not follow the Lord fully as David his father had done. And then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable idol of Moab, on the mountain which is east of Jerusalem, and for Molech, the detestable idol of the sons of Ammon, and thus also he did for all his foreign wives, who burned incense and sacrificed to their gods. Again, notice back up in verse 4. What word is used there 3 times in verse 4? His heart. That was where Solomon went wrong. His heart was not fully devoted to God. And so his wives were able to influence him. Now, turn back to chapter 9, verses 4 and 5, and look what God had told Solomon before. God appeared to Solomon, chapter 9, verses 4 and 5. As for you, God says, if you will walk before me as your father David walked, in integrity of heart and uprightness, doing according to all that I have commanded you, and will keep my statutes and my ordinances, then I will establish the throne of your kingdom over Israel forever. Just as I promised to your father David, saying, you shall not lack a man of the throne of Israel. So God had appeared to Solomon, and he said, Solomon, I want you to stay faithful to me, and I will bless you just like I blessed your father David, if you stay faithful to me. And Solomon knew what God's expectations were. Back up to chapter 8. In chapter 8 is when Solomon built that magnificent temple to God, and he sacrifices those tens of thousands of animals in worship to God. Solomon was really religious there early on in his life. And look Look what he admits in chapter 8 and verse 23. Solomon says, O Lord, the God of Israel, there is no God like you in heaven, above, on earth beneath, keeping covenant, showing kindness to your servants who walk before you. Notice those next words. With all their heart. Solomon knew what the truth was. Solomon knew where his heart should have been. But Solomon had given his heart into the pursuit of something else. Now Solomon started worshiping these different gods. Solomon had written in Proverbs 4, verse 23, keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it comes the issues of life. And now we see in his old age what his issues of life were, because Solomon gave his heart to somebody else. And so he started worshiping these false gods. And in fact, the god Milcom was a god whose worship involved child sacrifice. Milcom was built as a bull, the head of a bull. And his arms or his legs with the hoofs were there. The fire was built there in front of him. And you laid your baby, typically the firstborn son, in that, and you struck up the fire, and the baby's alive. And they're over there beating on the drums that cover up the sound of that crying baby who's burning alive. And Solomon gave himself to the worship of that. And he's the one who said back in chapter 8, there is no God besides the one in heaven. And now he's worshiping this God that you burn your babies to. How could he have gone that far? Because he gave his heart to somebody else besides God. Now Solomon, we don't have any record of Solomon himself offering these child sacrifices, but we do later on in Israel history. King Ahaz and King Manasseh both explicitly are said to have offered their sons in sacrifice to Milcom. And so what Solomon did paved the way for others to be even worse than him. And notice in chapter 11 how the historian contrasts the behavior of Solomon with David his father. Twice it said that Solomon did not follow God wholly, the American Standard says. He did not follow God fully, as David his father had done. Solomon was not living up to his heritage that he had received from his father. And it's because he had this misplaced love. And so notice God's attitude towards Solomon. We get an insight into God's heart here in verses 9 and 10. Look what the historian said in verse 9. Now the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart, there's the key word, was turned away from the Lord the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. And he had commanded him concerning this thing that he should not go after other gods, but he did not observe what the Lord had commanded. If you and I could look into the heart of God right now, would God be angry with us? If we could look into God's heart, say, Tuesday night, Wednesday morning, Thursday afternoon, if we could look into the heart of God and see how God felt about us, whatever it is we're doing at that time, would God be angry with us? God was angry with Solomon. He was angry with Solomon because, the historian says, he had appeared to him twice. God had given him a special blessing in appearing to Solomon. He didn't do that all the time, but he did that to Solomon twice. And that shows us a couple of things. Number one, to whom much is given, much shall be required. God expected Solomon to live up to higher expectation because he had given Solomon a higher blessing. And the second thing we learn from that is just because a man talks to God doesn't mean he's going to be faithful to God. Just because a man can rise from the dead doesn't mean people are going to believe in him. It still comes down to whether or not your heart is right with God and whether or not you want to do what God has commanded. Notice what the historian says. That God had commanded Solomon not to go after those false gods. God had specifically told Solomon, go worship false gods. But the historian there says at the end of verse 10 that he did not observe what the Lord had commanded. Solomon had seen God, aside from Moses. Moses had seen God as face-to-face as a human being can. Now, I don't think Solomon saw God in the same way Moses did, but he saw God in some way, and it did not help him stay faithful. Why? Because his heart was not in keeping the Lord's commandments. That's what it all boils down to. That's what it starts in verse 1. Solomon loved somebody, something else besides God. And so at the end of our story here, at the end of the time we had this morning, God says, Solomon, I got to punish you. God is holy. God can turn his back on sin. God can say whatever. God's holy. Sin has to be punished. So beginning in verse 11, the Lord said to Solomon, because you have done this and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes, which I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and will give it to your servant. Nevertheless, I will not do it in your days for the sake of your father David, but I will tear it out of the hand of your son. However, I will not tear away all the kingdom, but I will keep one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. You remember why Solomon married all those wives? To keep his kingdom together. He created all those political alliances so his kingdom would stay together. And what does God say? I'm going to rip the kingdom apart. The very thing that you wanted to do in leaving me behind is the thing that I'm going to shatter. I'm going to rip the kingdom out of your hands. And God does that. And we read at the end of chapter 11 what God does to King Solomon. He sends Rezon from Damascus, Syria. He sends Hadad, the Edomite, against Solomon, but most especially, he raises up Solomon's own Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of Labor, Jeroboam, who really tears the kingdom apart. Now God tells Solomon, I'm not going to do it during your days. I'm going to do it during the days of your sons. But, he says, I'm going to leave you one tribe. But it's not going to be for your sake. God says, I'm not going to establish a dynasty in the name of Solomon. I'm going to do it for your daddy's sake. You thought you could surpass daddy, and you thought that you could surpass daddy by leaving God behind? It don't work that way. God says, I'm going to leave you one son, one tribe, and that's for the sake of your dad. Because he followed forward. And so the kingdom is torn apart. There's 12 tribes that make up the nation of Israel. 10 of them leave King Solomon behind. 10 of them form their own nation. 2 of them, and really just one is the big one. That's the tribe of Judah, and that's why they're called Jews to this day. It's a shortened form of the tribe of Judah, along with Benjamin. And they stay faithful to the family of David. So in order for me to look out 23 years from now and see your faces sitting right there, what do you have to do to stay faithful? First of all, we saw with King Solomon that your ancestors are not going to help. It doesn't matter if your mom went here, it doesn't matter if your dad went here, it doesn't matter if your parents for generations went here. That's not going to help. It didn't help Solomon. It's not going to matter if you've got all kind of human wisdom and understanding. It doesn't matter what kind of degrees you've got. It doesn't matter what kind of education you have. It's not going to matter what people think of you outside of these walls. It's not going to matter what the world thinks. It's not going to matter how much money you have. If you want to stay faithful to God, there's only one thing that matters. Where's your heart? Where's your heart? I believe at one time my friend's heart belonged to God. But some place at some time over that 5-decade period, he gave his heart to the pursuit of some other pleasure. And following the commandments of God no longer brought him pleasure. What about me and you? Will we learn anything from King Solomon? Are we going to learn from King Solomon that we've got to give God our hearts and we've got to follow His commandments fully and we've got to make sure every